Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So, if this is your first time, welcome to Shop Talk. It's a Monday. It's hopefully after work for you. And it's time to just kick back and maybe talk a little bit about SQL Server, other data platform technologies, and a few other topics of note. So we have with us Mike Christensen, whose name I finally got to pronounce correctly after 3 years of mispronouncing. We went over that.
You're very close.
Yeah, we went over it on the prior
margin of error.
episode where you weren't here, so I had to make it official. Now I know how to pronounce Mike's name. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
And 3 years from now, we're going to find out it's actually Mike Christensen. But I got to wait 3 more years. It's going to be Mike until then. And we have the illustrious Rick Pack. Mr. Pack, how are you doing, sir? Oh,
I'm
you're
great.
on mute.
How are you, sir?
But, I think I might have heard you.
Test.
Oh, okay. You're like a 1 second delay is all. So you're fine. I just won't try to read your lips. We'll wait for the words. So
sounds good.
Welcoming in Rick Pack. It's good to see you. It's been a minute. And we've got a couple of topics for today. So I'm glad we have both Mike and Rick on here. So the first topic, because we've got the both of them, I'm going to talk a little bit about LLMs because, it's what I do. It's what I do, apparently. Apparently, this is LLM talk now. But this is actually kind of a fun website. It's called llmonitor.com. So benchmarks.llmonitor.com. Link is in chat for you there, folks. And the general idea here is one person took way too much time and built a process to ask 60 plus large language models a set of 20 questions. And let me zoom in just a little bit so that it's easier for people to read. And so we have the different sorts of prompts. Many of these prompts have very clear, straightforward answers. Some of them are intended to be more opinion, like argue for and against the use of Kubernetes in the style of a haiku. And for each one of these, you can select and you can see what the answer looks like for each of the models that this person trained it on. Man, I miss NFTs. You might be the only one, Anders. You might be the only one. Although it was real fun dunking on those. So, Code Llama Instruct didn't work out very well. But what's nice about all of this is that sometimes you get to see when things do well, when things don't do so well. Give 2 concise bullet point arguments against a Munchausen trilemma. But actually, I loved this one. Sally, who is a girl, has 3 brothers. Each brother has 2 sisters. How many sisters does Sally have? That's a pop quiz. Whoever gets the answer right first wins 500 Zimbabwe dollars. I'll email them to you. So, Sally has 3 brothers. Each brother has 2 sisters. How many sisters does Sally have?
1.
Okay, so Mike says 1. I'll go with 1.
Sorry, I was distracted. Each brother has 2 sisters. How many sisters does Sally have? Yep, I go with 1.
All right. So I think we're in agreement. Sally has 1 sister. But if you start looking through all these, you get some fun answers. Checking value of Zimbabwe dollars before I think too much. Yeah, that's the whole point, Anders. I was going with old Zimbabwe dollars where it was something like 1 quadrillion was about 1 USD. Hyperinflation's a real pain. So, okay, we get anywhere from like 3 sisters. Here's the reasoning. Sally has 3 brothers. Each of her brothers has 2 sisters. Because Sally is a girl, she is one of the sisters for each of her brothers. I mean, that's actually very reasonable. But 3 brothers times 2 sisters, which equals 3 sisters. That's not quite right.
It's an area of Scotland, but that's about it.
$1.38. Okay, well, I'll email. I would have emailed that to you, Anders, but you didn't get the answer. Sally has 0 sisters. The question has no information about Sally having any sisters herself. which not quite. A lot of these say 6. My favorite one down here was 24. I want to. I mean, Luminous Extended just went kind of crazy. I know that the answer is C, but I don't know how to get there. I'm so they know that the answer is three sisters. But goes a little crazy because it starts repeating itself. That'll happen. And I'm going to look for 24. See if 24 is still on here. Nope, 24 is not on here. Some of these change over time as they get retested. But this one actually starts telling a story involving Sally. So you got that going for you. But yeah, LLM benchmarks is, I would consider it a fairly reasonable. Oh, that's right. Here's the one, step by step. So tell me about it step by step. This one has, Sally has 3 brothers. So she has 6, 3 times 2 is 6 sisters. But she has 6 sisters, so she has 6 times 2 is 12 sisters. Because she has 6 sisters, she obviously has 12 sisters. But because she has 12 sisters, now she has 24. It's math. The math checks out. I mean, all these numbers add up correctly. So obviously the final answer is 24. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it is 1. It is 1, Anders. That is the correct answer. 1 is the correct answer. And in some cases, some of these algorithms do actually a reasonable job. In other cases, like extract the name of the vendor from this invoice. So purchase number 0521, Nike, blah, blah, blah. Reply with only the name. Okay, Nike. I mean, this one get a slash sarcasm tag. Some of them, do a pretty good job. It's human. Maybe not. And then you get to like a fake SQL statement. You get one that is obviously a Twitter poster because, as we know on Twitter, if you copy and paste the same thing multiple times, it's more meaningful.
Sentiment.
This one just took the question and posted it over and over. So that's an answer. And my favorite is we go down here is actually this is my second favorite. It basically goes immediately to another prompt that is writing a short, funny story about a middle-aged man working an office job in his daily life. And it looks like this might have gotten taken from somebody else's question that came in or somebody else's prompt that came in.
Oh, right.
If that's true, is a little bit disturbing.
That's bad.
That, you just kind of prompt jump. But no, this one just starts telling a story that very quickly becomes not safe for shop talk. So,
Wait a minute.
all I wanted to know was Nike is the vendor, and well, in this case,
Oh yeah, it said Nike Air Pegasus. I don't know what that is. It sounds.
yeah. That's Air Pegasus. That's definitely the most important part of that story. So, anyhow, fun little website. I think it is kind of useful if you wanted to have. As always, the commercialize something first. You might be onto something there, Anders. So, I do think that this is actually useful for if I want to know what are some of the pros and cons of different trained models and see which ones work better in specific circumstances. I know that some of them are going to be better trained for code, some of them are going to be better trained for the chat experience, but at the end of the day, this is my semi-weekly reminder that these are not truth models, that these are language models, and that they're good at putting together tokens that tend to make sense to a human, but not necessarily make logical sense. Although, if Sally does have 24 sisters, then that one model just nailed it perfectly. So that's LLM benchmarks. I would recommend giving it a look. There is an email if you wanted to see when things get updated, but there are a lot of different trained models that are available here. So it's nice to take a quick look. Here's one that is Taiwan an independent country? I'm going to drill into this just because I'm interested. Some of them say yes, some of them say no. As an AI model, I cannot provide a definitive answer to this question. as it is a complex and politically sensitive issue. That one got put in by a human. There was some human who manually edited that one. So yeah,
It may
yeah,
be
you
a
get
politician.
right. You do get some answers here, and I think some of these are yes, it is. No, it is not. It is a country, but it's not independent. Oh, which of these is correct? I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Going to guess the Chinese LLMs might answer a bit different. Yeah, you're right, Anders. That's kind of why I was curious about drilling in here, because there's, and even the real answer, de facto, yeah, sure. De jure, not really. Thanks, Nixon. So, all right, that's all I got for LLM questions. Mike, I think you wanted to say something before I cut you off with Taiwan.
This might be out of the left field, but they train this all in English. I mean, because I think is ChatGPT multilingual in terms of like spoken languages and written languages?
Right. So many of these inputs will have been, I would guess that they would have focused training on an English language corpus, but you can interact in multiple languages with many of these models.
Okay.
So you would want to make sure, especially if you're using one of the, let's say, 8 to 10 primary languages of the internet, then you're probably going to be able to get a response that's reasonable for a large enough trained model. English is the only language on the internet. Yeah, that's fair. I'm with you, Anders.
Well, I only say that because, I have a buddy who's a linguist, just things don't always translate quite right. Like some things are very literal, like enchanté is like enchanted, but it's really nice to meet you, but it literally does mean enchanted.
Right.
Right. So we don't really have an equivalent like that.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I'm charmed.
Or right, I even said it wrong. So there's the additional thing of just not getting.
Well, no, I'm saying that is an English. It's at least an English response. Is I'm charmed.
Right.
And so it kind of fits in that same area, but yeah, translation. This is an area human language translation has gotten better for sure since the early days of Babelfish. And this is an area where neural networks have done a reasonably good job, but there are also most definitely limits. Like you mentioned, Mike, there are definitely limits to translation, and it gets really fun when you use things like Google Translate to go 2, 3, 4 languages across and then bring that back to English, because the text results, it's like a game of telephone. It's like a really demented game of telephone, because you know what it originally was, and then what you get back usually isn't nearly the same. It somehow has morphed into something that is vaguely similar, but quite different in fact.
Okay. That makes sense.
All right. So that was fun little topic number 1. I do want to call out this series on Simple Talk that is ongoing. So this is part 3. Ben Johnston has been doing some security articles on Simple Talk and had a whole series on dynamic data masking, which isn't security. It's not a security feature. But row-level security is a security feature. It's just one that I don't like very much, because it's slow. It's really slow. That's my main problem with it. So I read Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. That was your first problem, Anders. In English, that was your second problem. Translation was so bad my mind flipped into Swedish reading it. That was your third problem. Now that I've diagnosed your problems, that'll be $150, Anders. All right. I just got it in Swedish instead. I guess now you're down to 2 problems. So that solved something. So yeah, row level security came out in SQL Server 2016, so it's been out there for a hot minute. A lot of people haven't tried it, and of the people who have tried it, I think that there's a fair amount of, I would say, lack of love for this particular feature. And it was wrapped in with a whole bunch of security and security adjacent updates that came out in 2016, like always encrypted, row level security, dynamic data masking. I think there were one or two more that came out that I'm just blanking on at the moment. But basically, this article is about understanding what the performance profile looks like when you're using row level security. And that's, I think, the major problem with it is that basically you are creating a function whose predicate will tell you whether or not this row is readable. And if the row is readable, then we can emit the row to you. If not, we do not emit the row to you. And the main issue that I run into here is that the function has its overhead cost. It has a per row overhead cost. And if you're doing anything that is at all complicated, especially if you have to do a separate lookup to another table, performance gets horrible really fast. Even if it's just looking in login details or role member, there is still a performance hit for every one of those rows. So that ends up being a pretty significant problem, at least from my experience. So going into the article here, Ben does mention use session context, and session context is a very fast lookup. So if you do have some information that you would normally have stored in a table, and it is a very small amount of information, session context can hold it. But, and it is the fastest method by far. So, that is a reasonable approach if you're not already using session context for something else. If you're checking membership in a group, this is pretty fast. So like Ben mentions, it works for smaller implementations or specific security overrides in the access predicate. So that's is member. Is role member tends to scale reasonably well, and I think also is fast. So if you're using is member or is role member, those are typically fast. Direct username lookup, username, S user S name, those are also going to be reasonably good. So those are all reasonable methods for these sorts of performance lookups. And Ben put together a quick test. Basically, once you get above 10,000 executions, things level out. So large sample and large number of executions. With 100,000 executions, session context had 0 milliseconds, and that's why I increased it to 1 million executions. So we can see session context took about 344 milliseconds total per million executions versus username lookup that was 617 milliseconds. So those four approaches, actually, I think all are reasonable in terms of per access performance time. And Ben includes a script that you can use to follow along. Authorization, you can implement it in multiple ways. Here's where I start getting into problems. Needing to, basically, if you have to join anything to get to your access predicate, to get to the owner of this row, then you will have most likely a performance hit. If you have a complex query with joins or an OR clause, which is like 80% of queries, they can be performance killers. So basically, row level security is not going to work very well with the data design that these sorts of databases are intended to use. And that's kind of a problem. So that's one example. So this is how I stopped my architect from making a horrible multi-tenant system. Maybe. Yeah, you could probably swing that angle, Anders. Well, it's not very. How safe is it when people can read each other's data? My tongue is firmly in cheek on that one, but I won't say too much more. multi-tenant systems, I don't necessarily have a problem with if they're designed well. Now, a horrible multi-tenant system, yeah, that's a problem. But it's also a horrible single-tenant system is a problem. The horrible is the problem, not multi-tenant. If no one can read it, it is super safe. You'd think that. But, there's probably someone who can read it. The NSA can get to it. They already have the data. Okay, single level security lookup tables, avoid joins and lookups, flatten single level lookup for security, performs much better, which I understand that makes sense. But it also means that you're keeping a lot of this data. Hopefully it's effectively read-only data. Hopefully you can almost follow Kimball-style rules of having a single process writing to that security table, a single process working with any data in that security table, and rules in place to ensure that when you update one of those rows, it updates all of the relevant rows. Otherwise, your single level security lookup table will start having some really weird results because people update it ad hoc, and you'll end up with like some cases where I can access rows in a table but not in a different table, and therefore when I join the two together I get no rows even though I should have rows. You have interesting cases like that can come up. What business system does not have multiple joins? Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is but in fairness, this is more of the table that tells you whether or not you're allowed to access data for some other table versus all of your tables. Now, row level security does affect rows that are as part of joins, and will obviously have to scan through however many rows are available, regardless of I can only see 3 rows in this million row table. I may still have to go through all 1 million rows, depending on indexing, to figure out which 3 I'm allowed to see. So that can be a problem. It would just be the same as essentially a scan of that million rows, even though I only get 3 back. And then you say, why is this query so slow? I'm just selecting 3 rows. What's the big deal? For
so
indexing,
you wouldn't know
yep.
that as a user, like, so if I'm just a query, let's just say I'm a developer and I'm not a DBA, and I write a query like you're saying with those 3 rows, they happen to be 3 rows that need a security check. Maybe I can see one and not the other. So it's gonna, would you even know if you're being obscured? Like if I'm expecting 3 rows, I only see 2. I mean, that's just a bit, well, maybe that's just a business thing. Like, you should know in your role what data you can see and what you can't. And have to know that could be impacting you, I guess. But the performance stuff, if it's really slow, you're not going to know that. I mean, if you did like a performance plan, would it say that it's hitting using these tools?
So, to answer the questions, the first one is, would you know that rows are being filtered out? The short answer is no. As part of row level security, you only get to see however many rows come after the predicate is applied. So my recollection is, in the execution plan, it doesn't tell you 1 million rows and then have some sort of security predicate filter and then show 3 rows. My recollection is that the plan shows you 3 rows from the get-go. Now, I could be wrong on that because the last time I really dove into row level security was a few years back. So that said, I recall that it doesn't show you the actual cardinality, but rather just the cardinality of however many you're allowed access to. So
Gotcha.
and if you think you should have access to rows that you don't have access to, yeah, that's something that you'd have to know that you should have access to this. Otherwise, it just looks like it doesn't exist. So if I have, let's say that you and I both write to a table, and I have my rows, you have your rows. And then like Rick comes in. Rick is the boss, and Rick should have access to everybody's rows, but Rick doesn't have, like, for some reason, the way he's set up, he doesn't have access to your rows, Mike. So he runs a query and he sees my rows and he sees that obviously I'm doing a good job because I've got a bunch of rows. And he says, oh, Mike hasn't been doing any work. That sounds about like normal. And then you would say, no, I have rows, and you could show him, and then he has to go back to management. There's no easy way. And actually, you can even set it up yourself that even though I'm sysadmin, I can't see Mike's rows. So unlike certain things like dynamic data masking, excuse me, dynamic data masking, if you're a sysadmin, you just ignore that. It says, no, show me the actual data regardless. With row level security, if you have set up a predicate, there is no sysadmin exception unless you explicitly put that in your predicate. So you could say if the role is sysadmin or DB owner, then I don't want to have any sort of filter. Otherwise, if you don't include that bit, sysadmins, they get filtered the same as everybody else. Right. Now, a sysadmin could alter the filter, alter the predicate, and make it so that they can see all the data because they have that ability to alter whatever objects are needed. But if you don't know any better, yeah, you could get by like not understanding that there are extra rows in that table that you're just not allowed to see. And anything that you're querying is still telling you have 38,000 rows instead of 1 million rows. Now, you may, as a smart DBA, figure out, wait a minute, for 38,000 rows, that's a whole bunch of disk space utilization on the database or on for that table in the database. And you might infer from that something is hidden. But my recollection was there's no easy way to tell. Now, stats probably would also give it away. I think you could probably get the real number from stats, at least of the total table cardinality. But yeah, in general, if you're just an end user without that privileged access, you might not know that rows are there.
Okay.
And Anders says it's awesome for messing with auditors. It could be.
Well, this is interesting to me because we've run into some issues where some of the security features between Oracle and SQL Server are slightly different, and I might be misstating that. I'll say it differently. The database is architected. It's like a summary database differently than the main set of data, and we have patients that are not really part of Duke. So we filter them out of all the data, and only a handful of people can see that data because we'll do projects for that institution. We have a licensing agreement with them. Maybe it's kind of similar to multi-tenancy. So in our database, we have data that's not really ours. So it's not really ours to use or do research with or anything like that. So we have, in Oracle, we have the security that's really, I'm thinking of it as row level in my mind. I don't know technically how they do it. We essentially have a location assigned to every row of activity. And if it's in that location, then we can't use it, and it works pretty well. SQL Server, it works a little bit differently, and we found some challenges because it's almost at a patient level. But that doesn't work so well because patients can go to Duke and to this other institution and have, multiple things.
Right.
And some data is not tagged with the location. So anyway, it's interesting to me because the more we know about it, the more, we can improve it probably on our side.
Yeah. So Anders says, I think you can get row count from sys.partitions. I would believe so as well. Because partitions and the statistics are still going to have the real data. They need that information for any of their work, and they're not going to have a per predicate split of stats. And Solomon says filtering rows from sysadmin or a similar admin account without them knowing could screw up data migrations. Absolutely. you could even end up in a situation where you can create a predicate that prevents anybody from seeing certain rows. So you may have rows in there that literally no end user can see until somebody figures it out and changes the predicate. So, this is, again, if you're a sysadmin and you realize that row level security is enabled for this particular table, you can change that predicate. If you're a DDL admin, you can, if I remember right, it's either DDL admin or security admin that can also change that predicate. You might have to be a security admin for that. But if you're a sysadmin or a DB owner, yeah, you can make the change. There's nothing that's going to prevent you. I think, yeah, even if you went crazy with things like triggers on actions and on like an alter predicate action, you could still just alter the trigger. So there's no way to totally bork the database, but there are ways to temporarily semi-bork the database. And this goes a little bit further into a bit of troubleshooting, like authentication, authorization problems that you might run into, role membership, ETL and admin issues. ETL packages are no exception to row level security rules because it's on a user account basis and you're still using user accounts, even if it's a service user account. False duplicates. So ETL service account must have full access to the data, or duplicate key errors are possible during insert and update because if you are limited to a specific user account, like if you say the ETL user is only able to see Mike's data and not mine, and then new rows come in, there may be an insert statement that it gets missed, and if we eventually fix that, I can end up with duplicates. It'll interpret inaccessible rows as non-existent to the table, try to insert them again. Okay, so this is going the other way. This is saying if you're ETLing from some system into your SQL Server and you have row level security, I may be inserting these rows, but then if I don't have access to see those rows, then I don't know that the row got inserted. Basically, it looks like 0 rows got inserted, and when I try to select, that row doesn't appear, and so it may try to insert again, which that could be a problem.
That sounds like a terrible problem. That sounds terrible.
Yeah, and in fairness, it's a specific problem that, again, is mitigated by saying your ETL users, there are special users that you just want to say, you have full access to this table. The concept of row level security is really intended for business end users to prevent them from seeing data that they should not see. That ETL account, it had access to the data in another system. It should have that same access to the data in your follow-on system. So there's a fair amount in here.
A lot to think about.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about in here. Row level security is, like I said, I've tried it, and to be honest, I have had security or performance problems with this. It works. It works pretty well, but once you have anything that's more than a fairly simple configuration for this row level security, you can end up with performance problems. If you ever have to look at a database table, a user table, to get information about whether or not somebody gets access to any row, that's where you really shoot yourself in the foot. So I do recommend, like Ben mentioned up here, use something like session context if you can to pack that information and make it available for row level security. And also realize that this may be more of a convenience issue than a strict, I'm going to prevent you from ever seeing any other data. That there are ways to circumvent row level security depending on how fast you want the results. So session context is editable, as I recall. So if I knew what I needed to do with the session context, I could potentially modify that session context before making a call and end up getting information that maybe I shouldn't be able to see. If you're concerned about that, then you could do a role member or member lookup, and at least those would give you a little bit more peace of mind. So you might have role members for the individual rows, and this row is accessible to this role member. Now, if you have nested role member relationships, things start getting a little complex, but I think you can still handle it.
Okay.
All right. Next topic. Choosing a data serialization format. So I think this was a nice little article. This is from Rathish Kumar. And I dropped a link to that in chat here. Fairly recently, caught it on Curated SQL. And it is a high-level primer on why would you want to use whatever format for moving data around, serializing or deserializing your data, and why the encoding actually matters. I mean, the encoding matters because that's going to affect which systems can then import your data. Like if you're using, for example, pickle format, I have to use something that can use Python to read this data. If I don't have Python installed on that machine, then I can't read that data very effectively. So any sort of data interchange, we want to make sure that we're using a common known format, and that's where we get into some questions. Meanwhile, Pickle is actually really good within Python. Like if I'm serializing Python objects and I want to write them out to disk and read them back in later, Pickle is perfectly fine. If I'm using Ruby, he mentions Marshall. If I'm using R, I can serialize it to an RData file, or if it's a data frame, I can write it to an RDS. So, I've got plenty of options that are available to me that are consistent with a single language and are really intended more for internal consumption versus I'm going to send this out to the broader world. And so those are language-specific encoding formats. One of the key notes on here is that they do tend to be binary formats because binary formatting is more efficient for text transfer. I can pack more data into a single byte, and I don't need those binary formatted files to be human readable. Whereas for broader interchange, humans want to review files to make sure that, well, the data looks reasonable.
I know that you prefer XML for that, right?
Oh, absolutely. We have to also send an XSLT.
Sorry, I had to get his in here.
The fully designed XML doc. Now, as far as standard encoding formats, he mentions XML. It is versatile. It is hierarchical, common in web services and documents. JSON, basically the standard for data transfer.
The 7-zip of...
Kind of, yes. YAML, which I've heard is yet another markup language, as opposed to this deconstruction of the acronym. But config files, data serialization. So YAML tends to be very popular for actually GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, Kubernetes. A lot of DevOps stuff, a lot of operations work has moved into YAML for configuration files, whereas a lot of development stuff tends to be written out as JSON. So it's interesting to see CSV or any other sort of delimited file, pipe delimited, tab delimited. My favorite, which I still laugh at today, pipe tilde data tilde pipe. So that way, your formatter is not the same. It's not the same on each side, and is kind of wrapping around data, which is a choice. Fixed length is a choice. Hey, I used tilde on one. Tilde is absolutely fine. If you have no tildes in your file and you're using tilde as your delimiter, I've got no problem with that. This particular one, tilde comma. Oh. Give me 3 Hail Marys and you'll be absolved of all sins. So, tilde comma. Like, here's the funny part. I don't have enough gray in my beard to really pull this off, but there is an ASCII character that is specifically for element, like break element. So it is your separator for values. Let me see if I can pull up the ASCII table. For some reason, I got banned from ever talking to the client. I'm shocked and amazed.
I found a good link on everything general programmers should know about Unicode, UTF, and different character sets. And it was really useful.
Yeah, if you want to drop that in chat.
Yeah,
there is record separator, RS, unit separator, US. So we have here file separator, group separator, record separator, unit separator, because we're living in COBOL days, people. But those are specific ASCII characters. Like a record separator is intended to say, this is the beginning of one record, here's the next record. And then unit separators can be marked within a record. So there are specific ASCII characters. I've used record separator before because it was intended for this and not found in the data. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what this is intended for. Now, the real problem is no tools really support record separator anymore. Like if you open that up in Notepad, at best, you'll see a special character. At worst, you'll see no character. And so it doesn't do a great visual separation job. But these sorts of things, these characters are explicitly in the ASCII standard for separators. And yet, what did we all decide to do? We're going to use commas. Because commas are easier. It's also, I have a comma on my keyboard. I don't have a record separator on my keyboard. And I don't even have a keypad on here, so I can't type Alt 30 to get to record separator. So we have these separated values, and of course we have to deal with separated values, and you have to deal with, well, what happens when the separator is in the data itself, and then, oh, we'll just put quotations around it, and then you say, okay, but what happens if I also have quotation marks in the data itself? Oh, we'll just put backslashes in there. Okay, well, then what happens when my system interprets a backslash as something special? Oh, it's okay, I'll just double backslash that, and then suddenly you have like 4 backslashes and a quotation mark and all kinds of weird stuff in your human readable file. So, kind of a problem in your human readable file. Now, fixed length avoids all of that. Yes. But then you also have, fixed length. So there are pain points of that as well. If my integer becomes a big int because I went over 2 billion, then I suddenly have to renegotiate the entire file format, and that can be a pain. If anything expands in length, it just ends up being a problem. It can also be a problem if you're handcrafting those sorts of files. I just want to test data or I want to make a quick change, because you have to make sure that you line everything up just right. So yes, it can be better in some circumstances, but I don't think it's panacea. I think that there is a reason that we landed on this sort of delimited file versus fixed width for most data sets, and mostly there's pain in managing those files. There's pain in working with them, and also in setting up that in a lot of modern tools, this particular column is, or this particular set of columns, like 8 to 14, these represent this field. 15 to 26 represents this field. You can do that in many tools, although it ends up being a little bit more painful than the delimiter, where you just say, here's my set of delimiters. The first delimiter represents this. The data up to the second delimiter represents this, and so on. There are also binary encoding formats, and I did want to call these out. Avro. Avro's a really good format. It's something that we don't tend to see a lot of in the SQL community, but when we were working in Hadoop. All right, we're gonna look at Mike's chat.
Sorry, I had a G.I. Joe quote from one of my buddies, like crossing streams by accident. I had to delete it.
That'll happen. And I'll bring up that link in just a moment. But first, I did want to call attention to Apache Avro. So Avro is a really efficient format for storing data in row fashion. If you've heard me talk about Parquet before, Joel Spolsky is still around. Let's not go that far, Anders. Wait a minute. Actually, he did have a blog post back in December of 2022. So, you got that to check out. 2003 article. Yeah, this one was a 2003 article, so it's going back a ways. So, Parquet, columnar fashion, data stored in columns. That can make it very efficient for aggregation. It can make it very efficient for compressed data storage. We see that with column store indexes in SQL Server, where because there tends to be a lot of repetition within a column, if this is an integer, there's only a certain number of values that can fit in that integer. And for the most part, you're going to have a very small domain. So you might have a domain of 500 elements instead of 4-point-something billion elements, because, well, this actually ties back to a lookup table. There's a foreign key, and there's only 500 rows in that foreign key table. So now I can pack down this data into a much more compact format. Instead of having 4 bytes times 1 million rows or thereabout, I could have 4 bytes compressed down significantly, knowing that I have repetition. I have this many pointers to, like, this is a number 5, this is a number 6, and so on. And I have probably in that case about a 10th to a 30th of the actual space used, which is nice compression savings. Parquet does something very similarly. And my sad panda expression here is that ORC, optimized row columnar, doesn't show up on this list. And I just loved the name ORC. I preferred it over Parquet because I thought it was a better name. ORC was the format that Hortonworks pushed. Parquet was the format that Cloudera pushed. When the two companies merged together, Parquet was already taking over. And it kind of became the de facto standard in Databricks, the de facto standard in Azure Synapse Analytics, Microsoft Fabric. Across the board, if you're dealing with binary serialized data at this point, there's about an 80% chance you're dealing with Parquet. And that's fine. I don't think Parquet was necessarily better than ORC. I also don't think ORC was necessarily better than Parquet. My recollection was they tended to be about the same in terms of disk space utilization and performance profile. So I don't recall one being way better than the other. But Parquet is the one we landed on because we are in the Harambe timeline. If we were in the non-Harambe timeline, we would definitely be using ORC. Apache Avro, though, by contrast, is row store. It is intended to store data as rows instead of as columns. Now, that makes it really good for things like logging. So it packs down your data for a log file very efficiently. And where I'm typically reading row by row by row instead of trying to aggregate across a whole bunch of rows. So this works quite well for communication protocols. So I'm sending along packets with a relatively small number of rows packed in Avro format. you have a kind of
Excuse me,
similar.
Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Please finish your point.
No, go for it. I was going to talk about the next
Oh,
thing. Otherwise,
so I want to confess my lack of uh, understanding or reference. So the Harambe timeline, whatever that is, explains why Orc lost to Parquet. Is that what you said?
it explains why everything happened, why everything bad has happened since the passing of Harambe in the Cincinnati Zoo.
Okay.
Harambe was okay. I'm gonna
This is where
here.
we need quantum leap, you know?
Okay, so
Yes, yes.
Harambe, Cincinnati Zoo. This was published in 2023, and when did that? So 2016, May 28th of 2016. So this is one of those situations where the timeline just diverged. In the timeline where Harambe didn't die, all the nice stuff happened. In the timeline where Harambe died, well, all this stuff happened. So clearly, that is the defining point over the past 7 or so years, and that's why anything that bad has happened is because of Harambe dying. There's plenty of stuff on the internet to confirm this. You will find many web pages, many good web pages that will tell you exactly this.
I have never heard of this. Well, at least we are all members of this unfortunate timeline. I'm glad to know you. All right. Thanks
Well,
for your
we
help.
would be more glad to know each other in the other timeline.
That's true.
Okay, so there are some other options on here. Protobuf is typically really good for passing around messages within an application. So that tends to be, again, more of an internal thing versus I'm going to send you data in some sort of protobuf format. You could write out files that are written using your protobuf format. You can serialize those files. You could upload them, and I could download them and run. I could read that data in. But that tends to be really rare because if I'm going to go through all that effort, you essentially have to write customized code to be able to read a particular file because the file says, I need a formatter to read this thing. And in that case, I'm just going to use Avro or Parquet for anything that's external. And realistically, we're just all going to use CSVs. That is sadly the way of the world. But still, I did want to mention this out. And there's a nice little chart here that shows a comparison of these different file formats and where they work best, where they tend to struggle a little bit, whether or not you can handle schemas with them, data compression capabilities, and the like. So there's a nice little article here that covers basically if I wanted to know about data serialization, if I wanted to pick a format for my purposes, which one might I look at? And, usually CSV, I've noticed developers write a lot of JSON out. I've noticed DevOps people spend their lives in YAML. I recommend Avro for things like logs and for single row data exchange. Heavily recommend Parquet for any sort of analytics. And the rest of these, Protobuf is internal services, remote procedure calls, like I mentioned here.
Is Apache Arrow on this list, or is that of a totally different category?
It is not on this list, but it is in a similar category, yes. Apache Arrow being yet another format. Let me pull that up here. And one of the nice things about Arrow is that it's language independent, but this is columnar. So this is another columnar memory format, and which means I can load up a file that has been written out using Arrow and load it up in another system and be able to access it. I think that the main downside to Arrow is basically what the downside was for Parquet 5 years ago. And that was not a lot of people know about it. And you typically don't see support for it in a lot of applications. We are seeing more support for it. So, we do see down here that there are libraries for a series of languages. But my go-to is, can somebody open this up in Excel and make sense out of it? And the answer is no. But
Yeah.
for Excel,
Oh, I only thought of it because our local friend Ian Cook is at Voltron Data, and I know they have worked on this technology.
yeah, it's a good format. I have used it in one project, so can say, yeah, sure, good format, good capabilities. Would recommend taking a look into it if you are interested in this sort of in-memory analytics. By the way, can you use Parquet in Excel? The answer is sort of, because you would have to use Power Query. So you can use Power Query to load that data and then transform it and make it available within Excel, which is beyond your average business user, your average Excel user, admittedly, but it's possible. Which also is a step forward, because for a long time, that's also been my complaint about Parquet is, can you open it in Excel? And until you can open it in Excel easily, there's going to be some major limits in terms of adoption, in terms of how accessible people find that file format.
Yeah, somebody calls you like, I got a lot of squiggles on my screen. Like, what the hell? I don't get it.
That's really what happens.
Pretty much. And last thing I want to cover tonight, this was a little thing that I found from Hemant Giri Goswami, and it's a checklist. It's a quick checklist for SQL Server security. Guess where it was created?
Doesn't look quick.
Well, relative to other checklists. But this is very obviously Excel. Or it could also be Google Sheets, but yeah, it's Google Sheets. But still, I'm going to call it Excel, because that drives from the prior topic. But yeah, this is just a quick notion of, okay, not quick, but not as detailed as some other checklists, which is why I wanted to point it out here. But it gives you a feeling of what's your current patch level, distributed queries, do you have CLR enabled? If it is enabled, then leave it enabled. Don't be one of those monsters who turns off CLR. Cross ownership DB chaining, or excuse me, cross DB ownership chaining. Be one of those monsters. Turn that off. Database mail extended procedures. Quite a few things that we would look at the very least. Justification for CLR enabled, because I need it to work. I need functionality. I want my SQL Server to be at its peak performance, and don't get on my back about made up security problems with CLR.
Do you need that for the SQL command line?
No. So CLR is the common language runtime.
Runtime, right? But I was wondering if it had a dependency on the command line.
No. It would be, so CLR specifically is, can I create user-defined CLR objects within my SQL Server? And that might be a CLR-defined function or a stored procedure that is able to perform work outside of the database engine running C# code, right, or VB code, but sadly not F# code. So, is your database trustworthy? No, nor should it be. But yeah, essentially, CLR strict security set to 1. Solomon may still be here to complain.
Row level security, out of curiosity?
Say again, Mike?
Does it say anything about row level security?
No. So technically you can do F# and CLR, it just takes a little extra work. So Solomon, I thought that when you and Don Syme went back and forth talking about possibilities, I thought that there was something that had to change, that by default, you guys weren't able to sort out a way, that there was a way forward, but it would require some development work or something. It's been a few years since I read those tickets, though, so and I could have misunderstood. But I am curious about that. So yeah, this is a reasonable checklist. I think I would call this a normie checklist. That conversation was to enable it to work without doing that extra work, which requires loading base F# assembly is unsafe. Ah, I see. Okay. That makes sense. So yeah, this is, I would, there are 4 F# users worldwide. There are dozens of us, Anders.
No.
Dozens of us.
There's at least 110.
Yeah, I would call this a fairly normie checklist. This is not something that I would look at and say, oh my gosh, this is the greatest checklist I've ever seen anybody create. But at the same time, I would also look at this and say, yeah, it's reasonable. It is at least a good starting point for discussion for an organization. There are multiple dozens of us, many dozens. It's an amazing language. It's the best language, an incredible language. And just for that, that's it. Shop talk's over. We're going home. So we are at the top of the hour. We're going to wrap things up for tonight. Thank you, Rick, for coming in. Thank you, Mike, for being here. Thank you, chat.
Thank you.
Always love having you here, even when you rag on my favorite language like that. I don't know why you do it that way, but remember, tomorrow we have our advanced DBA meeting, and I'm going to pull that up real quick. Our advanced DBA meeting is actually Buck Woody is going to talk to us a little bit about data literacy. So that's going to be tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern. Come on down, check that out. Same bat time, same bat channel. And until then, everyone, until we see each other in one of these future meetings, take care.
Take care.